Welcome to the Crunch McDabble Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show where we break down the Pathfinder Second Edition rules into delicious bits of strategy. Today's show, we take an exhaustive look at how much damage is +1. You know, this question, it comes up all the time in Pathfinder Second Edition because you have 3 actions each round. So it's, should I use one of my actions to get a bonus on an attack, or should I just use that action to attack, right? For example, should I use one of my actions to demoralize a monster and then attack it, or would it be better just to use that action to make another attack? What we are really asking is, how much extra damage does that +1 bonus give me, and is that damage more than I would get from a second or third attack at -5 or -10? With that being the question, I begin my answer with a disclaimer. I use averages and average damage to answer this question. However, that is just one of the many ways you could use statistics to break this down and draw conclusions. So what I'm saying is, this is not definitive, it's not perfect, it's just one way of looking at it, and I think we can draw some interesting patterns here that could help us understand the game better, but just don't get too carried away with this and think that it's a definitive answer when it's not. So let's start at the beginning. You make a roll to attack, you grip that shiny D20 in the palm of your sweaty little hand and fling it across the table to see if you hit the goblin, and then what happens? Well, based on the situation being your attack roll and the opponent's armor class, there's going to be one of 20 different outcomes from that die roll, and we can map out each one. What happens when we roll a 1? What happens when we roll a 2? And on and on. Then, if we add up all those possible outcomes and then divide that by 20, we get an average result for that situation. Let's look at a real-world situation. Let's say I have a +10 to hit, and I'm attacking a target with a 20 armor class. The numbers 1 to 9 on the D20 result in a miss. The numbers 10 to 19 on the D20 result in a hit, and a roll of 20 on the D20 results in a critical hit. There are all our hits and all our misses, but we need to represent those with some damages, and we use average damages for that as well. So let's say we're using a longsword and have an 18 strength. This means the average damage for each time we hit would be 8.5, and the average damage on a critical hit would be 17. If I add all these numbers up and divide by 20, we get 5.1 average damage for that scenario. And there it is. That is average damage right there. It takes all the possible outcomes for each equally likely scenario and averages them out. Now, rather than making an array like this, we could just use percentages, and that will make this a little easier to keep track of what's going on. Look at this. Since each outcome is equally likely, each has a 5% chance of occurring. That means we can multiply each outcome by 5%. So 5% of 0 is going to be 0 on all of these. 5% of 8.5 on these hits is going to be 0.425 on each one. And 5% of that 17 damage is going to be 0.85. Then look what happens when we add these up. We get the same thing. It's 5.1. Now, it's great that that worked, but that doesn't make it any easier unless we group these percentages together. All of these misses, we're just going to ignore. Each of these hits, they're worth 5% each, and there are 10 of them, so that's 50%. And there is just one critical hit here, and that's 5%. But since critical hits are usually double damage, for simplicity, let's just call critical hits 10%. So we have 50% from regular hits and another 10% for the one critical hit, and we get 60%. Then we multiply 60% of our average damage, so 60% times the 8.5, and we get, look, it's the same, 5.1. So now you can see that this lets us quickly and easily get an average damage just by multiplying each number that hits by 5% and each number that critically hits by 10%. So that's pretty interesting at this point. You can just grab any character sheet you have. You can look at your average damage for that character. You can take 60% of that, basically a little above 50%, and you'll be getting your average damage in an average scenario. So that's kind of neat. But then what happens when the number to hit goes up or down? Let's try that out with another situation. So now what happens when we add a +1 to our attack? The numbers change a little. The numbers 1 to 8 on the d20 result in a miss. The numbers 9 to 18 on the d20 now result in a hit. That's 50% again. And the numbers 19 and 20 on the d20, those are going to be critical hits. And since those are 10% each, that's 20%. So then you add that up, the 50% and the 20%, you get 70%. So a +1 moved us from 60% of our average damage to 70% of our average damage, which is an increase in damage of 10% of our average damage. So adding +1 gave us a 10% increase in average damage. If we increase by +1 again, it increases to 80% of average damage. Increase it by another +1 and we get 90% of average damage, and increase it by another +1, we get 100% of average damage, and on and on. You can see that an increment increase for each +1 step was 10% of your average damage. Now, if we go the other way, as monsters get harder to hit, let's see what happens. So if I need an 11 on the dice to hit a monster, it breaks down like this. The numbers 1 to 10 on the d20 result in a miss. The numbers 11 to 19 on the d20, now they result in a hit. That's 45%. Now the numbers 20 on the d20 results in a critical hit. That's 10%. It dropped 5% this time. In fact, from here on down, I'm only ever getting a critical hit on 20 instead of on 2 numbers, so my critical hit's always going to be 10%. And my regular hits are decreasing 5% per number. So instead of changing 10% per step down here, it only changes 5%. So needing a 12 on the die is 50%, and a 13 on the die is 45%, and on as we go down. So what do we see? Needing a 10 on the die to hit is the midpoint. Getting better to hit from there increases the damage 10% of average damage per step, and getting worse to hit from there decreases 5% of average damage per step. Good enough? So again, if you're trying to figure this out in your head, start with 60% of your average damage. That's your base. Then figure if the monster is harder or easier to hit. Then adjust your damage either up 10% per step or down 5% per step from there. Neat, right? You can figure out the average damage in your head like a, like a counting cards in Las Vegas. Your DM's going to love you for that one. So if you graph this all out, you get that interesting hockey stick effect. Each +1 only gives you a +5% increase of your average damage until you reach the midpoint of 10 on the dice to hit. Then each +1 step is going to give you an increase of 10% of your average damage, and the line gets steeper. What this line represents is a percentage of our average damage. That means we multiply whatever this percentage is times our average damage to find out what the average damage is in that scenario. In other words, this average damage over here, this is the constant, and each percentage increase adds a percentage of this damage, either 5% or 10%. That is what makes it move in this nice linear fashion here. But what that means is, as long as this damage is the same, let's say for the same character, I don't really need to get bogged down in how much actual damage it is. I can compare the percentages instead. For example, if I know the average damage is the same for my character, a 20% of average damage is going to be better than 10% of average damage, right? I can just compare percentages, right? And that's going to be easier for us. So now that we have laid all the groundwork, let's just marinate in this knowledge that we've acquired for a while. We know that a +1 is worth either 5% or 10% of our average damage, depending on whether the monster is easy to hit or hard to hit. The problem with this is that now we have to make a lot of calculations as far as what I'm giving up and what I'm getting back. And that's fine, we're going to look at those things. But what I would like to do is give you 3 general principles for decision making at the table, and we'll take a look at why those are true. Then you don't need to be doing a bunch of calculations at the table, just follow the principles. Principle 1. you want to use buffs against higher armor class monsters. Let's look at a standard multiple attack penalty of -5 on the second attack and -10 on the third attack. Let's start way down here against hard to hit monsters. If you give up this third attack, which is giving you 5% damage, and then add a +1 onto this attack, which gives you 5% here on your first attack, and also a +1 here, which gives you 5% more damage on your second attack, now you can see that we gave up 5% and we got back 10%, which is a net gain. So we can see that it's worth it. And this continues to be worth it. Exactly the same. Give up 5%, get back 10%, as long as we make 2 attacks, right? Right on through here, here, all the way up until this point here. At this point, we're giving up 15% and we're getting back 15%, which means it's no longer a benefit. And then at 20%, we only get back 15%. We're actually losing damage if we do a buff. So you can see once the monsters start getting easier to hit, you stop getting a net gain. So that is principle 1. Use buffs against higher armor class monsters. And you can see there's a point down here where monsters get so hard to hit that even your second attack isn't giving you much average damage. And so it shows that against really hard to hit monsters, there is a point where you might want to use both of these actions to buff and debuff rather than just one of them. If both of these are only 5% or some really low percent, you may as well use them to buff your main attack. So you could demoralize and then use an aid action, or use a 2-action spell, or use something like that. That would be more valuable than making these 2 low chance to hit attacks. Do you see that? Conversely, we can see that low armor class monsters don't really require buffs and debuffs as much. You can see how juicy this second attack is in here. That thing, it's succulent right there. When you get up to around 50% with that second attack, that's really nice. And then look at this third attack, once it gets better than 15%, you may as well take it because you aren't going to get that much back by giving it up if you're only getting a +1. The point is you don't need to demoralize and ooze. Just swing away at it. I mean, not that you could demoralize and ooze anyways. Those things are fearless. Okay, principle 2. The more times you're going to benefit from a buff, the more valuable it becomes. In the example we just looked at, we got a net gain because we made 2 attacks. Those benefits combine to give us a net gain. That means the more times you benefit from the buff, the more valuable it becomes. And that is pretty obvious, but it means we want to play like we remember that this is true. So we want to plan out our buffs so we benefit from them the most number of times. For example, you don't want to move, demoralize, and then attack because you're only taking advantage of the buff one time in that round, and the frightened condition lessens at the end of the monster's round, which means the next round, it's either gone or it's diminished. So instead, you'd be better off moving, attacking twice on that first round, and then on the next round, when you have the full round, demoralize and then attack twice. By making the 2 attacks on the round that you demoralized, you reap the benefits twice instead of once. Also, principle 2 means that we want to time our buffs so that the other party members take advantage of them. If you demoralize a monster when everybody is attacking something else, only you get the bonus. But if you wait until your party is ready to pounce, all of a sudden, how much is that +1 bonus worth? It's worth 5% on my first attack. It's worth 5% on my second attack. It's worth 5% on all my fighters' attacks, and 5% on my barbarians' attacks, and it's worth 5% on my wizard's spell damage, and it's even worth 5% on my war priest's attacks. Oh, give me a break. Who am I kidding? The war priest still isn't attacking anybody, right? So how much is a +1 worth? Principle 2 says it could be worth quite a bit more if we time it just right. And finally, principle 3, the size of the bonus makes a difference. In all these scenarios, a +1 gives us a modest 5% increase, and it stopped being worthwhile against higher armor class monsters. If we were instead getting a +2, look at how much longer it remains a benefit. We keep on reaping an advantage all the way up here instead, even against the higher armor class monsters. And a +3, jeepers, a +3 bonus is always worth it in any circumstance. So how cool is that? Principle 3 says, always go for it when it's a higher bonus. Now I said there might be a fourth principle. Principle 4 is the wild card. It doesn't really belong here in this discussion, but we're going to do it anyways. It's actually pretty simple and intuitive. Principle 4 says disregard how much the bonus is worth and what you're giving up, and instead, when you're playing the game, try and create situations where a favorable outcome is more likely than an unfavorable one. Does that make sense? See, the problem you're going to run into when comparing average damages is that it can get a little bit misleading. Let's say I boost an attack that has a 5% chance of hitting and I move it up to 10%. I might think I did a good thing there, but the reality is I left myself there. There's still a 90% of the time I'm going to have nothing happen. That's the vast majority of the time I'm getting nothing. So that's not really a good scenario when you really think about it, right? Here is the classic illustration for this. Let's say I had an attack that dealt 1 million damage, but it only hit 1 in 1 million times. So from an average point of view, that would be 1 damage per attack. But from a practical point of view, it may as well be 0 damage because it's never going to happen. But let's say I had an attack that only deals 2 damage, but it hits 50% of the time. It has the exact same average damage, but it's going to way out damage the million damage attack because you're getting 1 damage really frequently compared to 1 million damage never. Here is my favorite example of this. I call this the Hoskins maneuver. Vanessa Hoskins plays a swashbuckler on one of the Roll for Combat shows that's out there. In a combat against some troglodytes, she moved up to engage, but then she spent 2 actions to ready an attack for when another character got into the flank. Now, from an average damage point of view, 2 attacks is going to be more damage than 1 attack against a -2 armor class, right? I mean, we can do this in our head real quick, just loosely. Let's just say it's a 10 on the die to hit, that's 60%. And a second attack at -5, that's going to be -25%. Less than that. So that's 35%. Add the 60% and the 35% together for 95%. An attack against a -2 armor class would be 20% better. So that's 80%. So you have a difference of 95% or 80%. Look at that. We did that in our head. That was cool. However, I love the Hoskins maneuver. It takes into account probability and tries to tip the scale so that we get a really probable occurrence of a favorable outcome. So what does this mean? Use Principle 1, use Principle 2, use Principle 3. Principle 1, use buffs against hard-to-hit monsters. Principle 2, use buffs so they get used a lot. And Principle 3, the higher the buff is, the more worth it is. But don't get too carried away with those trying to buff low probabilities. Principle 4 says try to create scenarios where favorable outcomes are likely. In the end, I hope this has been useful and it gives you something to think about at the table. I hope it helps you make better informed decisions. However, always, always, always trust your gut. Never be afraid to do the wrong thing. You gotta be the hero that you are meant to be in this game. That means sometimes you gotta buck the odds and just go for it. So that's the McDabble's way when it all comes down to it. This stuff's interesting. Think about it. Don't get too carried away with it. I've been your host, Crunch McDabbles. This has been the Crunch McDabble Show. Survive Galarian with the Hoskins maneuver. Woo! Instead, move and attack twice, and then on the next round, demoralize and then attack twice. See how that works? You're just getting, see how that works?